Welcome to Book Talk. Personal rivalry has always been one of the driving forces in politics, but there's never been a rivalry to match that of the two giants of the Victorian era, William Gladstone and Benjamin Disraeli. Their duel went on for decades, each succeeding the other as Chancellor and then as Prime Minister. It's all the subject of a new book, The Great Rivalry, by my guest today, the writer, historian and indeed former MP, Dick Leonard. Now, Dick, these are such huge characters. I think it's possibly worth starting by asking you, if you would, to give a thumbnail sketch of each of them. What were Gladstone and Disraeli like as individuals here?
Well, they were very distinctive characters. Disraeli was born a Jew, of course, but at the age of 12, his father had had a row with the Orthodox synagogue that he belonged to, and walked out in a huff and had all his three children baptised into the Church of England. Disraeli was 12 then. If this hadn't happened, he would never have been able to have a political career, because Jews weren't allowed to be elected to the House of Commons until 1858. He had a very hard time in his youth. He was the only Prime Minister of the 19th century not to go to a public school. He was the only one, apart from the Duke of Wellington, not to go to university. He had to fight 3 elections as an independent radical, and then joined the Conservative Party, got elected to the House at his fifth attempt. Fortunately, his co-member for Maidstone constituency died shortly afterwards, and Disraeli married his widow, who was 12 years older than him. He had rather a loose career. He was a bit of a gigolo as a young man, or a toy boy in modern parlance.
Which is a huge contrast to his great rival, William Gladstone, who's a very proper figure.
Yes, indeed. And Gladstone had it very easy. He was born, in fact, the son of a self-made businessman whose fortune was largely made on the slave trade. He owned 1,600 slaves in the West Indies, and was a major beneficiary when the slavery was abolished in the British Empire in 1833. He got £76,000 compensation from public funds. And Gladstone, who had just been elected as an MP, was forced to defend this by his father in the House of Commons, which was a very odd thing for the future leader of the Liberal Party. But he had a very easy time. He was elected for a pocket borough provided by the Duke of Newcastle.
This is one of these places with very few electors, and the owner nominates the MP.
Precisely. He was nominated by the Duke of Newcastle, and was elected as a very young man at his first attempt at the age of 22, was a junior minister by the age of 24, in a very short-lived government led by Peel.
It's worth pausing just to think about how long he was actually in Parliament. It's as if someone today was becoming Prime Minister now, had been in Parliament in, the Suez Crisis. Something like that. Yes. He was in Parliament on and off for more than half a century.
Yes, I mean, he linked the time between Canning, whom he knew as a young man, and Asquith, who was a member of his last government, which is a period of about 60 years, I suppose. And he was an MP for nearly 60 years. So, as you said, with a short break when he lost his seat, he had to switch constituencies a lot. But he was a very religious man. He was oppressed by religion rather than liberated by it, because he felt all the time that he really wasn't living up to what God expected of him. And he wrote this enormous diary, which lasted over 60 years, published in 14 volumes, and it's really a confession to God as to how far he was falling short of the Lord's expectations on a day-to-day basis. This was quite different from Disraeli, who claimed to have no personal religious belief, but was very interested in religion, and made himself a very strong advocate of the Church of England, even though he wasn't a believer himself.
One of the interesting things about these two is that they came into Parliament at a time when the parties were very, very fluid. There was a lot of realignment going on. They'd just extended the franchise in the Great Reform Act, and in the backwash of that, a lot of things changed. And Gladstone in particular started his political career as a sort of stratospherically high Tory and ended up as a Liberal statesman, having sort of gradually moved across the political spectrum in the next decades.
Yes, well, they both moved. I mean, they were both elected as Tory MPs initially, but Disraeli was on the extreme left of the Tory party, and Gladstone was on the extreme right. Disraeli was responsible for splitting the Tory party when he opposed the initiative of Sir Robert Peel, the Prime Minister, who wanted to repeal the Corn Laws in the face of the Great Irish Famine. And Peel's party disowned him. He was viciously attacked by Disraeli. 3/4 of the party voted against Peel, and he was only able to get rid of the Corn Laws because the opposition Whigs supported him.
Perhaps I can give us a flavour, actually, of Disraeli's rhetoric, because he really made his name attacking his party leader, Robert Peel. And Peel had come to power as a defender of protection for farms, keeping the price of corn up so that the farmers could do good business and the landowners could benefit, and then abandoned that principle. And this is a lovely flavour you've got here in the book of Disraeli's brutal but very, very sort of feline oratory. He compares the principle of protection to a child being looked after by a nurse. Who can forget how its nurse dandled it, fondled it? What a charming babe, delicious little thing. Did you ever see such a beauty for its years? This was the tone, the innocent prattle, and then the nurse, in a fit of patriotic frenzy, dashes its brains out and comes down to give master and mistress an account of this terrible murder. And that was what he said in the House of Commons to his leader's face. It must have been a moment of fabulous theatre.
It was indeed, and Peel really never recovered from these attacks by Disraeli. He was driven out of his party. Out with him went nearly all the MPs, the Tory MPs, who had any ability whatsoever, leaving the rump of the party made up almost exclusively of country squires, none of them with any great intellectual ambitions, and Disraeli was really the only man of ability left in the House of Commons on the Tory side of the House.
And you had this magical figure almost, because he was a completely different figure to the people he aspired to lead, the party of the traditionalists, but there you had this exotic dandy at the head of them.
Yes, he made an absolutely disastrous start as an MP. His maiden speech was one of the least successful in history. He finished up by being laughed out of court by the House, partly because of his very florid language, but mostly because of being dressed in this extremely dandy way, and also because he quite unwisely chose to make a very controversial speech, whereas most members make a very, very non-controversial one when they make their maiden speech, just saying how wonderful their constituency is. But so he was left, but he then recovered and became probably the finest orator in the House of Commons. His only rival was Gladstone. Gladstone was a better speaker than Disraeli at public meetings, but Disraeli was better in the House, much more humorous.
Well, I've got an example here of Gladstone in action. This is some decades after this original speech. This is when Gladstone is campaigning against sort of British imperial... I beg your pardon, this is when Gladstone is campaigning against the Turkish atrocities, which is a great foreign policy cause of the day, and he's denouncing murders and terror that have been going on in Turkish provinces. Let the Turks now carry away their abuses in the only possible manner, namely by carrying off themselves their Zaptiers, their Mudirs, their Bimbashis, their Yuzbashis, their Kekamans and their Pashas, one and all, bag and baggage. You can almost see him in a pulpit doing that. It's a quite different style of oratory. The language is completely different. The force is there.
Yes, but actually that was a pamphlet he wrote denouncing the...
But it's his voice, isn't it?
Yeah. Yes, well, in fact, Gladstone was a very bad writer indeed. His sentences were much too long. His speeches also much too long. But his written language was very turgid. And there were just a few occasions in the heat of the moment when he was really worked up about something, when his passion broke through, and one of them was this pamphlet against the Turkish atrocities. Another one was against the Pope, when he declared papal infallibility. And Gladstone, as a very firm Protestant, was appalled about this.
The joke about Gladstone was he almost claimed it himself, I seem to recall. But yeah, the great rivalry between these two proceeded over several governments and several premierships. And it degenerated almost into hatred. There were a few warm moments. Gladstone wrote a very nice letter to Disraeli when his wife died, but most of the time it was bitter. Why was it quite so bitter? Why were they not just saying it's not personal, it's business?
Well, this was asymmetrical. Gladstone disapproved of Disraeli from the beginning. He regarded him as totally unprincipled and immoral. But Disraeli, who never disapproved of anyone morally in his life, I don't think, didn't at all feel the same way against Gladstone.
That wonderful line, he doesn't have a single redeeming defect.
Yes, that was what Disraeli said of Gladstone. It wasn't quite true. Gladstone was perfectly capable of sharp practice. But Disraeli, in fact, was greatly discomfited by Gladstone. Really, the beginning of their feud was when Disraeli was Chancellor of the Exchequer in a minority Tory government at the end of 1852, and he introduced a budget which was very badly thought out, and Gladstone absolutely tore it to pieces, and the result was that the government was defeated, and a new government was formed, which was a coalition of the Whigs and the Peelites, the dissident Tories, of whom Gladstone was then one.
Which was the kind of nucleus of the future Liberal Party.
Yes, precisely. And Gladstone became Chancellor of the Exchequer himself purely on the basis of the speech which had destroyed Disraeli's. So this is what started it. And over the years, Disraeli became more and more bitter towards Gladstone's feelings didn't particularly change because he despised Disraeli from the beginning. Disraeli became more and more frustrated and bitter against.
And was this rivalry, though, in any sense, a constructive one? And did it generate good things? Did it spur each on to achieve things that they might not otherwise have achieved, or take courses that were good for British history, even if they loathed each other?
Well, maybe it did. I mean, Gladstone introduced in the House of Commons a motion to have a new reform bill in 1866 to expand the franchise to some working class voters. Before that, it was entirely the upper and middle classes who had to vote. And Disraeli managed to defeat, as leader of the opposition in the Commons, Disraeli managed to defeat this bill, which was a great humiliation for Gladstone. But then, shortly afterwards, the government form changed, and the Tories came back again, another minority government with the Earl of Derby as Prime Minister and Disraeli as the leader of the opposition. As the leader of the House of Commons and Chancellor of the Exchequer. He then proceeded to introduce, having defeated this bill of Gladstone, to introduce another bill which went much further and sort of gave the vote in borough constituencies to the heads of all households, which meant a very large number of working class voters were added to the electorate. And I doubt very much if he'd have done this, if not to show that he could go one better than Gladstone. So it was constructive from that point of view, but in many other ways, their rival was extremely destructive.
Now, Gladstone outlived Disraeli by quite a long time. Was it a very different Gladstone when he didn't have his great rival there anymore? Was he unburdened? Was he diminished by the lack of a Disraeli?
Well, he didn't have this bitter rivalry, but he was faced by a very, very formidable leader of the Conservative Party, the Marquis of Salisbury, who in fact he was no rival for Gladstone as orator. They were in different houses in any case. Gladstone was in the Commons and Salisbury was in the Lords, but he was a very, very shrewd man. He was very reactionary, but an intelligent reactionary, and he got the better of Gladstone in many ways. I mean, he defeated Gladstone's attempt to give home rule to the Irish and split the Liberal Party in the process. I mean, Salisbury had always thought that the fact that the Whigs were lined up with the Radicals was an aberration. He thought the Whigs had the same interests as the Tories, and it was an aberration. He aimed to split the Tory party, the Liberal Party, and he succeeded.
Well, just because we're running very rapidly out of time now, just one final quick thought about the legacy of these two. I get the impression that Gladstone might well have rather approved of the way the Commons voted on Syria against an intervention in a foreign conflict a while ago. I get the impression that Disraeli's old slogan of One Nation is still very current in politics, having been appropriated by the leader of the Labour Party, Ed Miliband. So they do both leave a little bit of a legacy behind them, even now.
Yes. Now, Gladstone was not an imperialist. Unfortunately, he was forced to invade Egypt when he was Prime Minister, very much against his desires, but was pressed by the rest of his cabinet. His legacy was creating the Chancellorship of the Exchequer as the most powerful man in the government after the Prime Minister, which he hadn't been before, setting the taxation system on a firm basis. But he was a strong anti-imperialist who wanted to pursue a pacific, not a pacific, foreign policy in favour of international arbitration and so on. Disraeli inherited from Palmerston the jingoistic British tradition of throwing its weight around in the world. And this is the legacy which he gave to the Tory party, a robust foreign policy plus social reform.
And that's the One Nation bit.
Yes, that is One Nation bit, which Ed Miliband is doing his best to appropriate from the Labour Party.
Well, it's interesting to see that they still live on even 120-odd, 130 years on. Dick Leonard, thanks very much indeed for joining us. And Book Talk will be back again next week. Do join us then.